I signed it without reading. My hands were shaking too hard to hold the pen straight. Julian had already filled the pages, stapled, stamped, slid across the glass table. The pen was his, too gold and heavy, engraved with our company's logo. Just a formality, he said, his voice the same calm rhythm that had once convinced investors, friends, and me. It closes the books clean. The papers blurred when I tried to focus. My reflection on the glass looked steadier than I felt, hair neat lipstick, even eyes that could still pass for composed. I remember thinking, if I keep looking like her, maybe I can survive this moment. He didn't sit. He hovered. The office around us was stripped bare, his personal assistant already boxing photos and awards. He was moving headquarters downtown, he said. New energy, new people. Not once did he say my name. I wanted to ask why. Why the sudden restructure? Why the cold tone after years of shared work and whispered plans? Why the distance after the night we celebrated our first million in the same office, champagne spilled across the keyboard? But questions had started to sound like begging. I couldn't bear that sound from my own mouth, so I nodded and signed. He smiled, not with warmth, but relief. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "Trust me." Then he walked out, leaving his cologne and the faint vibration of the closing door. I sat there until the sun dropped behind the towers. The cleaning crew came in, pretended not to notice me. My badge no longer opened the main exit, so I slipped through the service door like a thief. In the parking lot, I folded the contract into my purse. The paper was soft from my sweat. I drove home with both hands trembling on the wheel. At a red light, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. It was the first time I noticed how much I looked like the women Julian used to pity, tired, out of breath, too loyal for their own good. When I reached my apartment, the silence felt violent. No notifications, no congratulations, no messages from Claire, who had promised to talk to him. I opened the fridge, one bottle of white wine left from the last gala I managed. I poured a glass, sat on the floor, and read the first line of the contract again. It didn't mean much to me then, just legal language and heartbreak. Termination of creative partnership with residual ownership acknowledgement. I couldn't even finish the sentence. Tears made the ink swim. I remember whispering, "What does any of it matter?" before tossing it on the coffee table. What mattered was gone. The next morning I woke with my makeup still on and a headache that pulsed with every memory. The contract lay under a water ring from my wine glass, the ink slightly bled but legible. I thought about shredding it, burning it something cinematic and final. Instead, I folded it again, slipped it into a folder marked Personal Taxes 2019, and buried it in a drawer. Days bled into weeks. I applied for jobs, but every interview seemed to end the same way: polite smiles, polite rejections. My references led back to him, and he'd already replaced me with someone younger, someone who knew how to stay in her place. The loneliness came in waves. I filled time with small tasks, reorganizing drawers, watering plants, pretending to write a business plan that no one would ever fund. Sometimes I'd drive past the new building he'd moved into. The glass tower gleamed like a blade in daylight. Through the lobby windows, I could see banners for upcoming events: the Keene and Company annual gala. My gala. The night of the event, I parked across the street just to see it once. The entrance shimmered with chandeliers, dresses, photographers. For a moment, I imagined walking through those doors again, confident, seen alive. But security wouldn't have to stop me this time. I'd already banned myself. The music carried faintly through the street, jazz laughter, the clinking of glasses. I rolled the window down and listened until the song changed until I felt too small to breathe. Then I started the car and drove home, my chest hollow, my hands steady for the first time in months. In the passenger seat, the folder with the contract slid open. For a second, I glanced at the signature, his and mine, side by side. The pen had pressed hard enough to leave an impression through 2 sheets. I touched it with my thumb, tracing the grooves. It felt strange, like holding a heartbeat that wasn't mine anymore. That was the night I promised myself one thing: if I ever found out what I'd actually signed, I'd make him read it, word for word. The days that followed felt like they were stitched together from leftover hours, uneven, disposable, half-lived. Morning bled into afternoon, then into the blue quiet of evenings that lasted too long. Without an office to go to, time had no shape. I started waking late, checking my phone before I even opened my eyes, hoping for a message that would make sense of what had happened. Nothing came. My inbox was an archive of endings, automatic HR messages, project handoffs, an old thread with Julian where every sentence began with "we." I couldn't bring myself to delete them, so I let them sit there like ghosts, proof that I once mattered. I tried freelancing. A few clients remembered my work from Keene & Co., but none of them wanted to talk about Julian. The silence around his name was thick. It meant power. It meant people were afraid to offend him. The one person who still texted me occasionally was Claire. Her messages were strange, half sympathy, half guilt. "He's under pressure, Lena. You know how he gets. Then you'll find something better, you always do." And finally, silence. I spent long hours at the library scanning job boards on a dim laptop, the air conditioning humming above me. The fluorescent light flattened everything. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the dark window and flinch, startled by the dullness in my face. One afternoon, a familiar name appeared in my junk mail folder: Claire Voss. Portfolio Archive. My stomach tightened. I opened it. It was brief, 2 sentences. "Found an old backup with your event concepts. Don't tell anyone I sent this. Thought you might want it before they clear the drive." Attached was a single zipped file, 12 gigabytes. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I hadn't seen my work since the day I left. My designs, marketing plans, full proposals, all of it had been on the company server. When I clicked the file open, dozens of folders appeared, each labeled with my initials. At the bottom sat one document titled Partnership Terms, Draft 2. Draft 2. The version Julian made me sign was labeled Final Agreement. I hadn't thought about that in months, maybe years. I told myself not to open it, that some wounds didn't need oxygen. But curiosity is a hunger disguised as control. The document opened in a flash of black text. I scrolled past the clauses, skimming legal jargon that made my eyes ache. And then a line near the bottom froze me. "All derivative intellectual property, in the event of separation, reverts to the original author of concept." I stared at it, reread it, whispered it aloud. Author of concept. That was me. My event models, my pitch decks, the very brand identity that made his company famous. Those ideas were mine. I'd drawn them on napkins during sleepless nights, stayed late, tweaking slogans he later claimed as his. The clause wasn't just generous, it was protection. It was something he'd forgotten existed before he altered the final draft. My pulse beat in my throat. I needed to know whether that line still existed in the version I'd signed. I went to the drawer, the one labeled Personal Taxes 2019. My fingers shook as I pulled the folder free. The contract was still there, its edges curled from the night of spilled wine. The words looked the same until I reached the section about ownership. The clause was gone, replaced with, "All creative property remains sole intellectual asset of Keene and Co." I read both versions side by side, my skin prickling with cold fury. He hadn't just betrayed me, he'd rewritten my existence. For the first time in months, the fog in my head cleared. Beneath the humiliation, beneath the grief, a single emotion took root: suspicion. What else had he changed? I pulled out my phone and typed Claire's number. It rang twice before she answered, her voice sharp with surprise. "Lena, I didn't think you'd—" "Who edited the contracts?" I asked. A pause. The kind of pause that carries weight. "Julian," she said finally. "He said it was just formatting. I didn't—" "You did?" I whispered. "You knew." She sighed. "Lena, it's over. Let it be." But it wasn't over. It had just started to breathe. That night I sat with both documents spread across my table. The first, the truth. The second, the lie. And between them, the space where my future had been stolen. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Because once you see the words they tried to hide, you can't unsee them. By morning, the apartment felt smaller, the air thick with stale coffee, and the weight of a truth that didn't fit inside its walls. The two contracts lay side by side on the kitchen table like bodies after a crime scene, one alive with protection, the other stripped clean. I kept staring at them, hoping they'd rearrange themselves into something less cruel. I should have called a lawyer, or anyone. But when you've spent years letting someone else define what's real, it takes time to believe your own eyes again. Instead, I opened my laptop and started searching through old folders, archives, anything that might explain how that clause disappeared. That's when I found the email. It was dated 2 weeks before my firing subject line, "Contract Revisions Final Pass." It was from Julian's assistant, copied to him and to me. I'd never seen it before because it had been marked as read, but the attachment, the one I'd never opened, contained the version I signed. The metadata showed last edits made by Julian. Keene at keeneco.com at 2:43 a.m. I read that timestamp 3 times. 2:43 a.m. was his favorite hour to rewrite the world: press releases, pitches, promises. That was when he felt untouchable. The rage came slow, a heat that started in my chest and rose to my face. I stood up, pacing the room, muttering fragments that didn't make sense. The contract wasn't just altered, it was stolen. He'd taken something abstract, trust, and turned it into property. I printed both versions side by side and highlighted the clause he'd removed. My hand trembled as I circled his edit signature. Julian. His name in black ink looked colder on paper than it ever had in person. Then came the fear. What if confronting him made it worse? What if I had no legal standing left? The line between courage and recklessness blurred. That's when I remembered Eli Navarro. He used to hover near the edge of meetings, the in-house legal counsel who always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I'd once caught him shredding a folder late at night, his tie loose, his eyes haunted. When he noticed me, he'd said, "Sometimes compliance means complicity," and smiled like it was a joke. I still had his card. I found it in my old purse, bent smudged with lipstick. Eli Navarro-esque. His number was still the same. My thumb hovered over the screen before pressing call. He picked up on the second ring. "Navarro. It's Lena Hartwell." Silence. Then a sigh, the kind that carried history. I wondered when this call would come. You knew, I said quietly. Yes, he admitted. I knew he edited it. I didn't stop him. Why? He hesitated. Because I wanted to keep my job, and because you looked like you already knew what he was capable of. The honesty hit harder than a lie. I found a draft, I said, with the original clause. It names me as owner. Then you have something he forgot to bury. I closed my eyes. Can it still matter? It depends how far you're willing to go, he said. Legally, morally. They're not the same distance. I just want what's mine. Then start keeping records. Everything you touch from here on out, keep a copy. They'll come for you once they realize what you found. That night, I followed his advice. I scanned every document, backed them up twice, emailed them to myself under a new encrypted address. I labeled the folder Inheritance. It felt like claiming a name I hadn't spoken in years. I didn't tell anyone, not Claire, not friends. The discovery was fragile, like holding glass too much pressure, and it would shatter. But somewhere between the fear and the fury, a new thought took root. If he'd forgotten one clause, what else had he forgotten? The next morning, I printed the original draft again and slid it into my bag. I wanted to feel its weight. I wanted to remember what power felt like, even if only on paper. When I looked at my reflection before leaving the apartment, I didn't flinch. I looked like someone who could start a fire. The next morning smelled like rain and burnt coffee, the kind of morning that tries to warn you. I sat by the window, the city still half asleep, replaying Eli's words over and over in my head, keep records. His voice had carried a tremor, as if he knew exactly how dangerous this game could become. When I called him again, it was after hours. The hum of city traffic filled the silence between our sentences. I found proof of the edit, I said. Metadata timestamp everything. He paused, and I could almost hear the cigarette he'd lit. Then you hold the match, he said. Question is, do you plan to burn the whole thing down, or just warm your hands? I didn't answer right away. I wanted to sound strong, but the truth was I didn't know. Revenge had never been part of my vocabulary. Survival had. Eli finally said, meet me. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., at 12th and Fairfax. There's a cafe, small, quiet. Bring the documents. I hesitated. Why help me now? Because guilt ages badly, he said softly. And because some men need to be afraid again. The next day I found him exactly as I remembered, same crumpled suit, same watch too loose on his wrist. His hair was grayer now, his eyes more sunken, but his voice still carried authority in half tones. He slid a napkin across the table and wrote a name on it, Harper Devlin, Corporate Records Division. She's a friend, he said, or was. She'll confirm whether your version of the clause is still registered anywhere in the state database. If it is, you don't just have a document, you have leverage. Leverage for what? For ownership, for truth, for whatever kind of justice you're after. I stared at the napkin like it might catch fire, and Julian Eli's jaw tightened. He's still got friends in the right places, but his arrogance, that's your advantage. He won't imagine you'd ever come back. I folded the napkin carefully, slipping it into my bag beside the contract. The paper rustled like a secret between us. When I got home, I couldn't stop pacing. Every sound, the drip from the sink, the rumble of cars outside, sounded like someone approaching the door. I'd read too many stories where women like me vanished into silence again, where justice was just another word for self-destruction. But then I thought of his voice, that calm, polished confidence when he'd said, "Trust me." I remembered the way he'd walked out of the office without even looking back, as if loyalty was something that could be erased with a pen. No, not this time. I called Harper the next morning. She answered on the third ring, her tone brisk and efficient. "Records Division, this is Devlin. Ms. Devlin, my name is Lena Hartwell. I'm hoping you can help me verify a contract registration from 2019. It may have been filed under Keene and Company." Her silence stretched long enough for me to think she'd hung up. Then, "Who referred you, Eli Navarro?" That earned a small laugh. "He still owes me coffee. Send me what you have. I'll see what I can find." I scanned and sent both versions within minutes. She replied a few hours later with a single line, "Original registration still active under your name." That clause wasn't fully replaced in the public filing. I reread it until the words lost meaning. My clause, the one Julian had deleted, was still alive somewhere in the state's legal archives. He'd hidden it, but not completely. For the first time in years, something in my chest unclenched. I called Eli again, barely able to keep my voice steady. "It's still valid. The clause." She found it. He exhaled sharply. "Then you're holding the weapon, Lena. Be careful how you swing it." Outside, thunder rolled over the city. I stood by the window watching the reflection of lightning scatter across the skyline. I whispered to the glass, "He's going to read it this time." And for the first time, the reflection that stared back didn't look afraid. It looked ready. By the end of that week, I stopped sleeping properly. My body felt like a wire stretched too tight, humming with the weight of discovery. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the line of text that had changed everything. "All derivative intellectual property reverts to the original author." It wasn't just a clause anymore, it was a heartbeat. Eli called again on Friday. "You ready to dig deeper?" he asked. "Define deeper." "Into the paper trail," he said. "Julian's empire looks clean from the outside, but every lie leaves a receipt." We met at a co-working space he used, sometimes tucked between a closed bookstore and a dry cleaner. The place smelled faintly of toner and anxiety. He handed me a thumb drive. "These are Keene and Company filings from the last 4 years," he said. "Half of them reference shell corporations under different names. He's been moving assets like chess pieces." "Why are you helping me?" I asked. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "Because I spent too many years pretending not to see people like you disappear. Call it penance." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed him or if I just needed to. When I got home, I spent the night going through the files. Rows of numbers, transaction records, legal amendments. I barely understood half of it, but patterns began to emerge, the same entity name repeating: Hartwell Concepts, LLC. I froze. It wasn't mine. I'd never registered any business under that name. But someone had. And whoever did had listed a single member on the paperwork: Julian Keene. He'd built a company using my name. My name, the same one he'd erased from his world, was now stamped across his shell corporations, his property transfers, his hidden assets. It was like finding a ghost version of myself living in his shadows. The next morning I met Eli again, slamming the printed pages onto the cafe table. He used my name. He scanned them, his jaw tightening. "Christ, that's not arrogance, that's evidence. He used your name to create a buffer in case anything went wrong." "It's fraud, Lena." Fraud. The word tasted electric. "So what now?" "We build the sequence," he said. "Timeline, motive, intent. You're not just a victim anymore. You're the witness he didn't plan for." We spent hours drafting notes. My handwriting turned messy, my thoughts sharper. I could almost feel my old self, the meticulous planner, the perfectionist, stirring again. Somewhere around dusk, Eli looked up from his laptop. You realize what happens if this holds right. What you don't just expose him. You become the owner of every project derived from your original work. The product line, the trademarks, the subsidiary contracts, all of it. You'd own his crown. The words hung between us like a dare. I should have felt triumphant, but instead, a hollow dread crept in. Power. I was learning didn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with no railing. That night back home, I printed the company filings and pinned them across my wall. Names, dates, signatures, a map of deceit. At the center of it all, Hartwell Concepts. My name stolen and misused. I sat on the floor, surrounded by papers, the city lights flickering through the blinds. I thought about the night he'd told me I was too emotional for leadership, about the way he'd said it gently like he was doing me a favor. I whispered to the empty room, "Let's see how rational you are when I take your company." But underneath the anger, something softer stirred, fear maybe, or conscience. I wasn't sure yet which one would win. My phone buzzed, a message from Claire. "He's asking about you." My chest tightened. "What did you tell him?" I typed back. No response, just those three dots blinking and disappearing. Outside, thunder rolled again, low and endless. I looked at the wall of documents and realized something. Once you start following the paper trail, there's no going back. And somewhere in those papers was the proof that would either save me or bury me beside him. The city smelled like wet pavement and perfume that night, the kind of evening built for people who win. Julian's Gala was the headline event of the season. New investors, celebrity partners, the same chandeliered ballroom I once spent sleepless nights perfecting. Every glossy magazine had a preview spread, every photographer knew his angle. And me, I had a ticket under a borrowed name. Eli called it field research. I called it closure. Either way, I needed to see it to see him once more before I took it all away. I wore black. Simple, sleek, the kind of elegance that doesn't need validation. A friend from my freelance circle had secured me a catering pass, a borrowed badge that read, Marina Porter, Logistics. It felt poetic walking into the same room that had once rejected me, this time hidden in plain sight. The ballroom was identical to the one in my nightmares, gold light string quartet, the soft rustle of wealth. Every table centerpiece was a design I'd once created, even the way the candles reflected off the mirrored base. My fingerprints were everywhere, and yet I was invisible. Julian stood near the stage, surrounded by board members and donors. His hair was shorter suit, darker smile, brighter. Cameras adored him. His voice carried over the music. This company is about vision, legacy, and the power of trust. Trust. The word made my throat ache. I carried a tray of champagne glasses across the room just to pass behind him. He didn't notice me. Why would he? To him, I'd been erased cleanly, and inconvenience crossed out in paperwork. But as the projector screen lit up behind him, my heart stopped. The presentation slides rolled through the company's milestones, and there among the images appeared my old logo mock-up, my design. My name, in faint text at the bottom corner, still visible. He'd forgotten to remove it. Eli's voice echoed in my memory. "He won't imagine you'd ever come back." He hadn't. I froze, tray trembling in my hands as Julian's voice blurred into static. The crowd clapped. I slipped toward the side exit, pulse hammering in my ears. Outside in the corridor, I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo of the screen through the open doors. The projection caught perfectly Hartwell Concepts, TM. My name broadcast across the same ballroom that had once banned me. It wasn't proof of everything, not yet, but it was the spark. The image burned into my screen like an omen. Then a voice behind me. Marina, right? I turned. Claire stood there in a silver gown holding her phone like a shield. She looked exactly the same, poised, polished, untouched by guilt. "It's been a while," she said. I didn't answer. She studied me, eyes flicking to the tray. "You shouldn't be here. Neither should that logo," I said. Her lips parted. A flicker of recognition, then fear. "Lena, what are you doing, collecting what's mine?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Tell Julian I saw it, and tell him I remember everything." Her composure cracked just slightly. "You don't understand what he'll do." "No," I said, slipping the tray onto a nearby table. "You don't understand what I already did." And then I walked out before she could respond, the sound of applause swelling behind me like a storm I'd already outgrown. Outside, the air was cool and sharp. I leaned against a streetlight, the glow washing my face pale. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt dangerous. I texted Eli the photo. "Proof found." He replied seconds later. Then the boards next. I looked up at the hotel's mirrored facade where my reflection stood ghosted against the skyline. Somewhere above me, Julian was shaking hands, unaware that the contract he'd rewritten, the one I'd signed in tears, was about to become his undoing. I smiled. "See you at the top," I whispered to the glass. The next morning, the world looked different. Maybe it was just the hangover of adrenaline, but every sound felt sharper. The hum of the refrigerator, the scratch of the pen as I wrote notes across my kitchen table. The photo from the gala glowed on my laptop screen, time-stamped, geotagged, irrefutable. Julian's smile still filled the frame perfect, and composed the logo of Hartwell Concepts, TM, flickering behind him like an accusation. Eli called just after sunrise. "You got what you need. I got enough to make him bleed." There was a pause. "Then we'll need to make sure you don't bleed first." We met at his office downtown, a small rented suite above a dry cleaner. The blinds were half closed, the air stale with the smell of paper and resignation. Eli had dark circles under his eyes, his tie loose. On the desk lay an audio recorder, the old kind with a red button. "You'll want to use this," he said. "Next time he calls, or when you confront him, record everything. His instinct is to talk himself out of trouble. I don't plan to give him the chance." He studied me for a moment. "You don't want revenge," he said quietly. "You want acknowledgement. They're not the same thing." "I want both," I said. He smiled sadly. "Fair enough." That afternoon, Julian called. I hadn't heard his voice in almost 2 years. It started polite, too smooth, the kind of tone that hides knives. "Lena," he said, like the name itself was an act of generosity. "I was told you were seen at the gala." "That's unexpected." "Unexpected or inconvenient?" He laughed softly. "You've always had a flair for drama. I learned from the best." "Look," he continued, "there's no need for misunderstandings. If you wanted to discuss something, you could have come to me directly." "I did once," I said. "You handed me a pen." Silence stretched between us. "Then, you think you found something? But you're playing in a league you don't understand." I let the recorder on my desk hum softly, its red light blinking. I understand contracts, Julian, and I understand theft. His breath caught almost imperceptibly. You're making a mistake. So did you, I said. You should have read the fine print. He hung up. The silence that followed was almost holy. I sent the recording to Eli. He knows I wrote. Eli's reply was quick. Good. Fear makes men like him sloppy. Over the next few days, I watched the story start to shift. An anonymous source leaked a note to a small business blog, rumors of irregular filings, ownership disputes. Nothing traceable to me, but it spread fast. Investors began to ask questions. And then late one night, I heard the ping of an email. From Julian Keene's subject, "Let's talk." My hands went cold. The body of the email was short, too direct to be anything but desperate. You don't want this to go public. Meet me. Tomorrow, 6 p.m., our old office. No lawyers. I stared at the words. The same office where it all began, where I'd signed away my future. I forwarded it to Eli, who replied immediately. Go. But wear the wire. The next evening, the city was gray with fog, the kind that swallows sound. I stood outside the glass tower, staring up at the floor where his office light still burned. The lobby security guard didn't recognize me. My heels clicked against the marble like punctuation marks on a story that was almost finished. Julian stood at the window when I entered. The skyline behind him glowed gold and white, all glass and illusion. You've changed, he said, turning. You used to look up to me. No, I said. I used to look past you. He smiled that practiced smile. What do you want, Lena? Money. A public apology. A deal. I placed the folder on his desk. I want you to read what you made me sign. He glanced down, irritated, flipping through the pages. We both know how this works. Then he froze. His eyes stopped on the highlighted section from the original clause. The realization dawned in his face like slow poison. You kept this, he said. You forgot it, I replied. For the first time since I'd known him, Julian Keene didn't speak. His mouth opened, closed, opened again like a fish pulled from its own water. I pressed stop on the recorder hidden in my jacket pocket. His silence was the confession I needed. When I left, the sky was breaking open with rain. The streetlights reflected on the wet pavement like signatures on glass. The war had officially begun. The Monday after our confrontation began like any other day in the city, commuters rushing coffee, brewing the illusion of normalcy. But beneath that rhythm, something was shifting. My phone was a storm of unread notifications, whispers, mentions, a slow trickle of questions bleeding into the public. Julian's empire was wobbling, and everyone could smell blood. By noon, the leaks had spread. Someone from the records division, maybe Harper, maybe a board clerk, had confirmed inconsistencies in Keene & Company's filings. The blog post that once seemed irrelevant was now being quoted by financial outlets. Words like fraud, intellectual theft, and contract breach began orbiting his name. Julian's response came fast, a press release with his signature charm. We categorically deny any allegations of impropriety. Keene & Company has always operated with integrity and transparency. I almost laughed. Integrity and transparency, the same two things he'd stolen from me. Eli called that afternoon. He's trying to get ahead of it, he said, but the board's already calling an emergency session. When tomorrow morning? And you're invited. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Invited. You're listed as an interested party under the original filing. Your name's still attached to Hartwell Concepts. They can't keep you out anymore. That night I sat by the window watching the storm roll over the city. Every lightning flash reminded me of the first night I cried in my car outside that same building. Only now, the tears were replaced with purpose. I wore a charcoal suit to the meeting, clean lines, no jewelry, hair pulled back tight. Eli met me in the lobby, looking 10 years older than he had a week ago. "Ready?" he asked. "I've been ready since the day he locked the door behind me," I said. The boardroom was colder than I remembered. 10 men and women sat along the glass table, their eyes darting between me and Julian, who was already there, his smile stretched thin. The air buzzed with expensive perfume and quiet panic. "Ms. Hartwell," the chairwoman said, "you've requested to present new information regarding proprietary ownership claims." Julian leaned back. "This is absurd. She's been out of the company for years." "Let her speak," the chairwoman said. I opened my folder and placed the two contracts on the table side by side. "One of these is the agreement I signed. The other is the version your CEO filed. Notice the missing clause." I slid the page forward. The projector behind me lit up with the scanned text. "All derivative intellectual property reverts to the original author." Julian's face drained of color. He reached for his water-glass fingers, trembling slightly. I continued, voice steady. "Mr. Keene not only altered my original agreement without consent, he also registered a shell corporation using my name to conceal financial transfers. The state filings confirm this." A murmur rippled through the room. One of the board members whispered something about liability. Another looked toward Julian as if seeing him for the first time. He stood abruptly. "This is nonsense. She's manipulating outdated documents for attention." Eli rose beside me, calm and deliberate. "The filings are time-stamped. We can produce metadata verifying every change Mr. Keene made." The room fell silent. Julian's jaw tightened. I could see it, the twitch near his temple, the thin crack in his performance. The chairwoman turned to him. "Is this true?" Julian hesitated, then smirked. "It's a misunderstanding." The word echoed like a confession. I looked straight at him. "You always called betrayal a misunderstanding." He didn't answer. His silence was louder than any denial. After a long pause, the chairwoman folded her hands. "Until further notice, Mr. Keene, the board is suspending your executive powers pending investigation. Ms. Hartwell will need to review your claim in detail, but if these documents hold ownership of the affected divisions may revert to you." My breath caught. It wasn't victory yet, but it was something close. Julian tried to speak, but his voice broke mid-sentence. For once, the room wasn't listening to him. When I left the building, reporters were already outside. Microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing, questions flying. I didn't say a word. Eli guided me past them to the car. Inside, he exhaled slowly. "You just killed a king." I looked out the window at the mirrored facade of the building I once built dreams in. "No," I said. "I just reminded him who built the castle." By the next morning, the story was everywhere. CEO suspended amid contract scandal. Former partner claims rights to Keene & Company assets. The woman behind the empire. My phone buzzed until I silenced it. Every news outlet had a version of me they preferred: the betrayed lover, the forgotten visionary, the quiet storm that toppled a man. None of them were wrong, but none of them were me either. I didn't leave my apartment that day. The blinds stayed closed, the coffee went cold. Every time I scrolled through the coverage, I saw my face old photos from company Gala's interviews. I'd forgotten giving even a quote Julian once fed to the press about my brilliant right hand. He'd never imagined those same words would one day incriminate him. Eli called mid-afternoon. "How are you holding up, famous?" I said, which feels like being hunted but slower. He sighed. "It's going to get worse before it gets better. The board's splitting. Some want you reinstated, others want to liquidate the affected divisions to save face." "Let them fight," I said, though my voice wavered. "I'm not going back." "Then what do you want, Lena?" he asked softly. That was the question I'd been avoiding. I'd built my life around what I didn't want: his shadow, his lies, his control. But what did I want in the aftermath of victory? The silence between us stretched until it became something fragile. "Peace," I said finally, "or something close to it." After the call, I turned off my phone and stood by the window. The city looked the same, indifferent, glittering, alive without me. Power, I realized, didn't feel like triumph. It felt like weight. Somewhere in that weight, I remembered the woman I'd been before him. The one who sketched campaign ideas on napkins, who stayed up until dawn dreaming of her own agency. She'd been buried under humiliation and contracts, but maybe she was still there waiting to be excavated. Then around dusk, someone knocked. When I opened the door, Claire stood in the hallway, no makeup, eyes red. Her voice cracked before she spoke. "I told him to stop," she said. "Back then. I told him what he was doing would ruin everything. Then why didn't you stop him?" "Because I was a coward." Her shoulders sagged. "And because he said he loved you. He made it sound like this was all temporary, that he'd fix it, that you'd understand later." The anger I'd carried for her all these years softened just slightly. Betrayal had 1,000 faces and hers looked like survival. "I don't need an apology, Claire," I said. She shook her head. "It's not for you. It's for me." She reached into her bag and pulled out a flash drive. Backup archives. Old investor emails, correspondence he thought he deleted. "You might want to read them before the lawyers do." I took it without a word. As she turned to leave, she said, "You were always the real visionary, Lena. He just had the microphone." When the door closed, I stood there for a long moment, the flash drive heavy in my palm. Later, as I scrolled through the files, I found it an email chain between Julian and the board, dated the week before I was fired. "If she signs the revised agreement, ownership rights will revert fully to Keene and Cohen. She'll never notice." I read the line 3 times the way you read an epitaph. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was documentation, a written record of erasure. I saved the email under a new folder, Final Evidence. Then I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the hum of the city outside. The vindication I'd thought would feel like fire, instead, felt like ash. There was no celebration, no sudden joy, just the quiet acknowledgement that justice doesn't repair what's already been broken. When I finally looked at my reflection in the window, I barely recognized myself. I wasn't the woman who'd signed in tears, or the one who'd begged for recognition. I was something in between, a survivor, but not yet free. And somewhere buried under exhaustion, a new question began to form. If I owned the company now, what kind of woman would I become to keep it? The next morning dawned pale and brittle, like paper left too long in the sun. I sat at my desk staring at the flash drive Claire had given me, its tiny red light pulsing with quiet promise. One click, and everything Julian had hidden would unravel completely. I opened my laptop, exhaled, and plugged it in. The files unfolded in neat rows, emails, scanned memos, private board notes. Every document felt like a confession, whispered too late. I skimmed through contracts until I found one labeled Ownership Transfer Proposal, Contingency Draft. Inside was a clause I hadn't written, but one Julian clearly feared. In the event of dissolution or fraud-related dismissal, all intellectual assets revert to the original conceptual author per agreement dated 2019. He had built his empire on a trap, and the trap had his signature. Eli called as I stared at the screen. "The board's offering you a settlement," he said. "Full payout NDA. They'll distance themselves from him and shut it all quietly." How quietly? Buried quietly. You'll walk away rich and he'll vanish behind medical leave or some publicist's euphemism. I closed my eyes. The idea of peace pressed against me like a sedative. Money, silence, forgetting. "And if I don't take it? You file the ownership transfer," he said. "You become CEO by clause authority. But once it's filed, you can't undo it. It's irreversible." Meaning the company, the lawsuits, the investors, they all become your responsibility. His enemies become yours. It's power with blood still on it. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. The transfer form was already open-filled, except for my digital signature. I'd spent years begging for acknowledgement, and now the world was practically handing me a throne. But power wasn't what I'd been chasing. I wanted to be seen, not become him. Still, I couldn't let it end in silence. Silence was his language, not mine. "Send me the filing procedure," I told Eli. He sighed, the sound halfway between pride and warning. "Lena, once you press send, you don't get to be anonymous again." I stopped being anonymous the day he made me invisible. He didn't argue. He just said, "Then make sure it's what you want, not what's left." When the call ended, I stared at the company's digital portal. I hovered over the button marked Execute Transfer of Ownership. My reflection in the screen looked calm, unnervingly so. The cursor blinked. My hand moved. Click. A loading bar appeared. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then the screen refreshed, and the new designation appeared in stark blue text: Primary Executive Officer, Lena Hartwell. It was done. No lawyers, no press, no ceremony. Just a quiet transaction that rewrote the story. I sat back numb. The power I'd been denied now pulsed at my fingertips, yet the victory felt hollow. I should have felt joy, relief, triumph. Instead, I felt something closer to grief. Because now that I owned it, I realized how much of myself I'd lost fighting for it. A message popped up on the corner of my screen. From Julian. "You think this ends with a form you'll choke on the same power you wanted?" I stared at it, then typed back, "No. I'll build what you broke." And I closed the laptop. Outside, the rain had started again, steady and rhythmic. It sounded different this time, not mournful but cleansing. I stood at the window and watched the city blur through the droplets. Somewhere below, people hurried to work, unaware that the name on the tallest building downtown had just changed hands. I whispered to the glass, "Read it now, Julian. Every word, because this time the signature was mine." The first morning as CEO felt unreal. I'd imagined it 1,000 different ways: confetti headlines, power suits, poetic justice delivered in front of flashing cameras. Instead, it was just me standing in front of the glass doors of Keene and Company with a key card that now bore my name. The lobby smelled the same: lemon polish, cold marble, the faint echo of ambition. I half expected someone to stop me to tell me I didn't belong here. No one did. The security guard scanned my badge, his tone flat. "Welcome back, Ms. Hartwell. Back." The elevator ride to the top floor was a slow climb through memory. Every ding of passing floors sounded like a ghost counting the years I'd lost. When the doors opened, the office stretched before me exactly as I remembered Julian's desk still there, his awards gleaming beneath recessed lights, the skyline glittering through the glass. He'd built this space to look untouchable, but in daylight it looked smaller. I walked toward the windows, running my fingers along the desk. A faint scratch caught my attention. The brass nameplate was gone, but the outline of his name remained in dust: Julian Keene. It should have felt victorious. Instead, it felt like standing inside a mausoleum. Staff trickled in slowly, uncertain, their expressions wary. I recognized a few faces: assistants, analysts, the receptionist who used to bring me coffee before Julian reassigned her. They looked at me as if I were an apparition. "Good morning," I said softly. "Please keep working as usual. We'll have a meeting at noon." No applause, no whispers, just the faint click of keyboards resuming. In Julian's office, the silence was almost oppressive. I sat in his chair, the leather stiff, the view panoramic. For a moment, I just breathed. The city stretched out like a reward and a warning at once. Eli arrived an hour later, balancing a box of files and a thermos of coffee. "You're officially in," he said. "They transferred everything overnight. Every division, every patent, every liability." "Liability," I repeated. "That word feels heavy." He smiled wryly. "It always is. You'll need to appoint new council, restructure the leadership team. Half the board's already trying to schedule a meeting. I'll handle them." He studied me for a moment. "You don't have to become him to lead this place." I looked at the skyline again. Maybe I already have. He set the coffee down gently. "You're nothing like him. He built this place on fear. You built it on pain. They look the same from far away, but up close they're worlds apart." His words lingered long after he left. At noon, I gathered the senior team in the conference room. Their faces were cautious loyalty, undecided judgment suspended. "I know this transition is unexpected," I began, "but I won't pretend it isn't earned. Some of you worked under lies you didn't choose. I don't hold that against you. What matters now is how we rebuild." Someone in the back, a woman I didn't recognize, asked quietly, "And what happens to Julian?" I hesitated. "He'll have to answer for his actions. But I'm not here to bury him. I'm here to build something better." The room stayed silent, but a few people nodded. The tension eased barely. When the meeting ended, I stayed behind. The projector was still on, a faint hum filling the empty space. I turned it toward the window and played the last company reel, the same one from the gala where my logo had appeared by accident. The colors danced across the glass, reflecting over my face. I whispered, "It was always mine." Outside, the city pulsed, alive, indifferent, eternal. The sun began to sink behind the skyline, bathing the office in orange light. I looked around the room one last time. It no longer felt haunted, just empty, waiting. Power, I realized, wasn't about the chair or the view. It was about walking back into the place that tried to erase you and refusing to disappear. I closed the blinds, picked up my bag, and left the lights off behind me. Tomorrow, the work would begin. The confrontation came 3 days later. Julian had been quiet, too quiet. I knew it couldn't last. Men like him don't vanish. They circle. I was in the boardroom reviewing the quarterly projections when the receptionist's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ms. Hartwell, there's a Mr. Keene here to see you. He says it's urgent." Eli looked up from his notes. "You want me to—" "No," I said. "Let him in." The door opened and Julian stepped through. No entourage, no suit jacket, just the wreckage of charm wearing a pressed shirt. He looked thinner, eyes shadowed. For a second, I saw the man I used to love, the one who had built dreams beside me before he turned them into weapons. "You shouldn't be here," I said. He smiled faintly. "And yet, here I am. You've redecorated. I haven't touched anything." "That's the problem," he said, walking closer. "You think changing names changes legacy. But this place," he gestured around him, "was built on my vision." "Your theft," I corrected. "Semantics," he said, shrugging. "You think you've won. You think power looks good on you. But you're drowning already, aren't you? You don't know these people. You don't know what it takes to hold them." "I know exactly what it takes," I said, my voice steady. "Because I survived what it takes." He laughed low and bitter. "You sound like me." "Maybe," I said. "But the difference is, I can still sleep at night." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "We built this together. Every late night, every risk. I made you, Lena. Without me, without you," I interrupted, "I might have believed the world was fair." He froze, eyes narrowing. "You think this company will save you? It'll eat you alive." "Same way it ate me." "Then maybe it's time it choked," I said. He stared at me for a long moment, and something flickered in his face. Anger, sorrow, pride, all tangled. "You really mean to erase me?" "I don't have to. You did that yourself." He turned toward the door, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "Careful what you wish for Lena. The higher you climb, the lonelier it gets." I didn't look away. Then at least I'll be alone on my own terms. He paused at the threshold, then smiled without humor. "You always wanted the last word." "No," I said softly. "I just wanted to be heard." Eli appeared in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Keene, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Julian lingered for one final moment, eyes flicking from Eli to me, then turned and walked out. The door shut behind him with a sound that felt more final than I expected. I sank into my chair, every muscle tight, every breath sharp. For years I'd imagined this moment, what I'd say, how it would feel. But victory, I realized, wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and heavy as truth. Eli stood by the window. "You okay?" "I don't know," I said. "It feels like the end of something, but not the right end." He nodded. "That's because endings never fix what came before. They just stop it from happening again." Outside, the city shimmered with late afternoon light. I looked at the reflection of my office door in the glass. For the first time, the name on it didn't sting. Lena Hartwell. It wasn't a trophy. It was proof. "File the restraining order," I said quietly, "and make sure he gets the notice personally." Eli nodded. "Consider it done." As the door clicked shut behind him, I turned toward the skyline, my hand resting on the desk. Julian's words echoed in my head, "The higher you climb, the lonelier it gets." He wasn't wrong, but loneliness didn't scare me anymore. It was just space to breathe, to build, to exist without apology. I looked out at the fading sun and whispered, "You should have read it, Julian. You should have read every damn word." The next gala came 1 year later. Same hotel, same ballroom, same glittering chandeliers, but everything else had changed. The banners no longer read Keene and Company. They bore a new name, Hartwell Group. I stood near the stage, the lights hot on my skin, listening to the orchestra tune. The room was full again, investors pressed the kind of faces that once looked through me. And yet for the first time, I wasn't performing. I was present. I should have been nervous. Instead, there was only calm, the kind that comes after a storm has taken everything it could. Eli stood in the corner nodding to me. Claire was somewhere near the back managing press. She'd asked to stay on as communications director. I'd said yes. Some ghosts deserve the chance to work in daylight. When the host introduced me, applause rose polite at first, then growing as people realized who I was. The woman who had been erased, now standing where her name had once been forbidden. I stepped up to the microphone. The ballroom lights dimmed until all I could see were faces curious, expectant, waiting for the story behind the headlines. "Good evening," I began. My voice sounded steady, even warm. "Some of you may remember this event under a different name. You might remember a time when this stage belonged to someone else. But time has a way of revealing who really owns what." A ripple of laughter, respectful, uncertain. I smiled. Every contract, every deal, every promise, they all have a clause about ownership. And sometimes the thing someone tries hardest to own. I paused, glancing toward the far side of the room where Julian had once stood, was never theirs to begin with. Silence filled the space, the kind that listens. "I'm not here to rewrite history," I continued. "I'm here to finish it. To remind you that integrity isn't a slogan, it's ink. And if you're going to put your name on something, read it. Read every word." The audience clapped slowly at first, then louder until the sound became a wave. Cameras flashed. I saw faces smiling, others contemplative, but all I could feel was lightness. Not pride exactly, something quieter. Completion. After the speech, I stepped off the stage and found Eli waiting with 2 glasses of champagne. "You did it," he said simply. "I survived it," I replied. He raised his glass. "To survival, then." We clinked glasses. The sound was soft, satisfying, the opposite of the sharp silence I'd once known outside these same doors. Across the room, Claire watched me. For the first time in years, there was no guilt in her eyes, just respect. I wandered toward the balcony, escaping the heat of the crowd. The night air was cool, the city glittering beneath me. Somewhere out there, Julian was probably watching the news, seeing my name scroll across the ticker. I hoped he was listening. The sky above the towers reflected faintly in the ballroom windows. For a moment, I saw my reflection there, the woman who had signed in tears, who had begged, who had fallen, and the woman who stood here now, steady and whole. I whispered more to her than anyone else. "You made it back." A breeze caught my hair, carrying away the words. I didn't need an ending. I'd already written one in ink and blood and truth. Below, the orchestra began to play again. I turned toward the sound, toward the light spilling from the open doors. It was my company now. My name. My story. And this time I'd read every word.